She held me close, like letting go would shatter her world, and somehow, I was the only one who could keep her together. It was an ordinary rainy afternoon, the kind where the world outside seems muffled, the colors softened by water streaming down the windows. I had ducked into a small cafe to escape the drizzle, expecting nothing more than a hot cup of coffee in a quiet corner to watch the rain. But then she appeared. She moved with a quiet elegance, the kind that doesn't demand attention, yet somehow commands it. Her coat was a deep navy, cinched at the waist, and her scarf fell in gentle folds around her shoulders. Even from across the room, I noticed the way she carried herself, calm, composed, yet there was an undercurrent of something fragile in the tilt of her head and the way her hands lingered on her cup. There was a grace to her, unmistakably effortless, and yet it felt like she was carrying something heavier than she let anyone see. Our eyes met for the briefest moment as she walked past my table. I felt a subtle jolt, like a quiet recognition of someone who didn't belong to my world, yet seemed to fit perfectly in the corners of it. She offered a small, polite smile, the kind that hints at unspoken stories, before continuing to the counter. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't anticipated. Her presence left a warmth lingering in the space where she had just been. I ordered my coffee, my gaze lingering on her without shame. There was a rhythm to her movements, the gentle tilt of her wrist as she lifted the cup, the way she paused mid-step, as if listening to something no one else could hear. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, floral and slightly earthy, like rain on cobblestone streets, subtle but unmistakable. I imagined that she carried with her the weight of experience, of years lived fully, yet with tenderness intact. She chose a corner table, opening a worn leather notebook and pen in hand. I could see the way her fingers traced each line with care, deliberate and precise, yet there was softness to the gesture, a contrast that made her all the more compelling. I wanted to know what she was writing, what thoughts occupied her mind. But more than that, I just wanted to be near her, even if only from a distance. Time seemed to slow. The world outside blurred into streaks of gray, the rain falling steadily against the windows, and all that existed was the quiet presence of someone who seemed impossibly real and unknowingly magnetic. There was no conversation, no introductions, yet the connection was immediate, subtle, and profound. As I settled into my seat, I realized I was holding my breath. There was a strange, tentative hope rising in me, the hope that our paths would cross again. And in that quiet cafe, in the gentle hum of rain and muted conversations, I understood something instinctive. Letting this moment pass without notice would be a mistake. She was someone I needed to remember, and somehow, I already knew that the next encounter would matter. It wasn't planned. Somehow, against all odds, our paths had crossed again. I didn't know if it was chance or some quiet pull drawing me into her orbit, but there she was, sitting at a sunlit corner of the park, a book balanced on her knees, the soft breeze lifting a few strands of her hair across her face. For a moment, I simply watched, hesitant to disturb the stillness, captivated by the natural grace in her movements. Her presence felt different this time, more grounded. She seemed unaware of how magnetic she had become, lost in her own world, yet quietly anchoring the space around her. I approached slowly, careful not to startle her, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. When she looked up, her eyes met mine again, and that same flicker of recognition passed between us. But this time, there was no polite smile. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth touched the corners of her lips, and I felt the pull of something deeper. Curiosity, trust, perhaps the hint of acknowledgement that she, too, felt the connection forming. We didn't speak immediately. I found a bench nearby, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence without intruding. The subtle details drew me in. The tilt of her head as she flipped a page, the delicate way she tucked her hair behind her ear, and the soft hum of contentment in the park that seemed to echo her own quiet serenity. When a stray breeze carried the scent of her perfume toward me, familiar now, I felt a shiver of awareness. It was a scent that lingered in memory, and now it was unmistakably linked to her. At one point, our hands brushed as she adjusted the book in her lap. The contact was brief, accidental, but electric. Her fingers lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, and I sensed her subtle hesitation, as if she was testing boundaries she hadn't allowed herself to cross before. My heartbeat quickened, but the moment was gentle, respectful, an unspoken agreement that this closeness could exist without words. We finally spoke, softly, in the way strangers sometimes speak when the weight of familiarity is just forming. She asked about the book I was reading, and I asked about hers. The conversation was simple, but it carried a quiet depth, a sense of mutual interest that went beyond small talk. Every glance, every slight shift in posture was a language of its own. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she laughed, how her voice seemed to resonate in the space between us, creating an intimacy that was felt rather than spoken. Before we parted, she gave a glance over her shoulder, one that held more than acknowledgement. There was a hesitancy, a flicker of something like vulnerability that made me want to reach out and assure her that she didn't have to carry the weight of her world alone. As I walked away, I felt her presence linger with me, a quiet gravity that drew my thoughts back even as I tried to focus elsewhere. That day, I realized something. She wasn't just a passing figure in my life. She was a presence that demanded attention, not in loud gestures, but in subtle, persistent ways that left me aware of her even when she wasn't there. And I knew, instinctively, that our story had only just begun. Time passed differently around her. After our second meeting, I began noticing how comfortable her presence made the space feel, like a quiet warmth that didn't demand anything but simply existed. We started spending more time together, not through grand gestures or long conversations, but through small shared moments that carried an intimacy words often fail to express. One afternoon, we found ourselves in a quiet library tucked away from the busier streets. The scent of old books mixed with the faint aroma of her perfume. Floral, warm, and faintly comforting. I watched her as she turned the pages of her notebook, her fingers tracing each line with care, and I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the gentleness in her movements. I took a seat a few tables away, pretending to read, but my eyes kept drifting to her. We didn't speak, not immediately, and yet the silence was not empty. It was charged with unspoken understanding. The small brush of her shoulder as she adjusted in her chair, the occasional tilt of her head toward the sunlight streaming through the window, the subtle hum of her focus, all of it spoke volumes. I noticed the warmth in her presence, the way her calm steadied my restless thoughts, the quiet reassurance that I could simply be near her without expectation. Later, as we walked through the narrow streets, the city around us muted by a light drizzle, she matched my pace without a word. Her shoulder brushed mine occasionally, intentionally or not, sending a shiver of awareness through me each time. I caught myself stealing glances at her profile, the gentle curve of her jaw, the way her eyes softened as she observed the little details around us. I imagined her noticing me in return, a fleeting awareness in the briefest exchange of glances. At a small park bench, we paused. She sat down, pulling her scarf slightly tighter against the chill, and I hesitated before taking the seat beside her. Our knees almost touched, close enough to feel warmth in the cool air. The silence stretched comfortably between us, punctuated only by the distant chatter of children and the occasional rustle of leaves. In that quiet, I felt as though I could understand her without words. The subtle tension of her shoulders, the faint sigh she let escape as she leaned back, the way her fingers traced the edge of the bench absent-mindedly. She looked at me then, catching my gaze, and didn't look away immediately. Instead, there was a faint smile, almost a question, almost an acknowledgement. I wanted to speak, to break the delicate spell, but I didn't. The moment itself was enough, heavy with quiet connection, trust, and the unspoken understanding that our companionship was slowly, inevitably deepening. By the time we left the park, I realized that these shared silences were more than pauses in conversation. They were a bridge, a subtle declaration that we were becoming part of each other's lives. Not through grand gestures or declarations, but through presence, attention, and the gentle art of noticing. And I knew that, with her, even silence could carry the weight of something meaningful, something fragile yet undeniable, something that might just change both our worlds. The more time I spent near her, the harder it became to ignore the quiet tug in my chest. Each glance, each accidental brush of her hand, seemed to carry an invisible weight, like the world had compressed into the small orbit we shared. And yet, with every step closer, I felt the pull of hesitation, not from lack of feeling, but from the understanding that some walls were hard to breach. She carried a past I couldn't fully see, and I feared that pressing too far, too fast, might shatter the fragile trust slowly forming between us. That afternoon, we found ourselves sitting at a small outdoor cafe, a corner tucked beneath a canopy of trees. The sun filtered through the leaves, painting dappled patterns on the wooden table. She stirred her tea slowly, her eyes distant, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup as though following an invisible path. I wanted to ask her what weighed on her mind, but the words stuck, caught between care and caution. Finally, she spoke quietly, almost in confession. She talked about moments of disappointment, about trust broken in the past, and the way life had taught her to guard her heart carefully. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind that hinted at both resilience and lingering vulnerability. I listened, letting her words settle around me, feeling the pulse of honesty in each syllable. There was no pleading for understanding, only the gentle revelation of someone carefully weighing the world's edges before allowing herself to be seen. I wanted to reach across the table, to reassure her, but I hesitated. My hand hovered over hers for a heartbeat, a silent question lingering in the space between us. When it finally landed, it was light, a touch meant only to convey presence, not to demand response. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly toward mine, a small gesture that spoke volumes. The warmth of her skin against mine was immediate, intimate, and grounding. It was a reminder that closeness need not be rushed, that connection could grow gently, deliberately, without words forcing it. We stayed there, silent for long stretches, letting the world move around us while our own orbit tightened. I noticed the way she glanced at me, almost shyly, almost as if measuring the distance between hesitation and trust. Every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the way her shoulders softened when I spoke softly, the faint lift of her lips in a smile, became a language of its own. And within that language, I felt the stirrings of something neither of us could yet name aloud, something tender, cautious, and achingly real. By the time we parted that evening, the weight of unspoken truths and fragile hope hung between us. I walked away thinking about her, about the careful balance of closeness and restraint she maintained, and about my own struggle to navigate the tightrope between desire and respect. In the quiet corners of my mind, I understood one thing clearly. Hearts so gently conflicted could still find their rhythm, if only we learned to listen to the pauses as much as the words. It was one of those evenings that linger in memory, the kind where the city lights blur into gold and amber reflections, and the air carries a gentle hush, as if the world itself is holding its breath. We were walking along a quiet street after a shared errand, the conversation between us sparse, punctuated by laughter that felt soft and unforced. The rain from earlier had left the pavement slick, and each step echoed faintly, giving the moment a kind of private rhythm. She stopped suddenly, her shoulders tensing just slightly, a small tremor in her posture I almost missed. She had been holding herself with the usual quiet composure, but something, fatigue, worry, or perhaps a memory, had slipped through the cracks of her carefully maintained exterior. I could see it in her eyes, the way they momentarily clouded, the tiny shift of her hands as she clasped them together. Without thinking, I reached out. My hand brushed against hers lightly, and when she looked at me, her gaze softened, though she didn't speak. I offered a small smile, an invitation without words, and she allowed herself to lean closer. Our hands met fully this time, intertwined naturally, fingers fitting together as though they had been meant to align from the start. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, and I felt a subtle, grounding steadiness, a reminder that she didn't have to face the weight of her world alone. Then, almost instinctively, I guided her into a gentle embrace. Her arms slipped around my waist, hesitant at first, then with increasing trust. Her cheek rested lightly against my chest, and I could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. It was both fragile and reassuring, a quiet declaration that she was allowing herself to be vulnerable, if only for this moment. The cool evening air brushed against our faces, the faint scent of rain mingling with the warmth she carried close. It felt like time had slowed, the city fading into the background, leaving only the intimate gravity of the moment between us. We remained that way for several minutes, neither speaking, yet everything unspoken was understood. I felt her body relax against mine, the tension of her day dissipating in the steady pulse of human connection. It wasn't dramatic or urgent, no need for declarations or grand gestures. The intimacy lay in the simple act of presence, of holding space for someone else with care and attention. When she finally pulled back slightly, our fingers still intertwined, her eyes met mine. There was a flicker of vulnerability, but also a quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken promise that this closeness could exist without fear. A small, shy smile tugged at her lips, and I knew that she felt it too, the beginning of trust deepening into something more, something tender and undeniable. As we continued our walk, our shoulders brushing occasionally, I realized that moments like this were the heart of what we were building. Intimacy through gentle gestures, emotional honesty, and the courage to let another person in without words. And in that awareness, I felt the first true warmth of belonging, hers and mine, quietly shared and carefully cherished. The days after our tender evening together were quieter, yet heavier with unspoken emotions. Every glance, every accidental brush of her hand, seemed to carry more meaning than words could convey. I found myself noticing the smallest things, the way her fingers lingered on a coffee cup, the soft furrow of her brow when she was deep in thought, the way her eyes met mine and held a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. And yet, there was no denying the pull, the silent gravity drawing us closer, even as hesitation tugged in the background. It was a late afternoon when it finally happened. We were in her apartment, sitting side by side on the couch. A soft light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the room, dust motes floating lazily in the quiet. She seemed different, quieter, more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing down at her hands as if weighing whether to reach for mine. The moment felt delicate, fragile, as though speaking too soon might shatter it. She broke the silence first, her voice soft and tentative. She spoke about her fears, the fear of letting someone in after being hurt before, the fear of losing control, the fear of trusting in something that felt larger than herself. Every word was laced with honesty, a bare, emotional truth I felt pressing against the space between us. I listened, heart tightening, wanting to comfort her, to take some of that weight into my own hands, and yet knowing that this was her story, her moment to share. I reached for her hand. Our fingers intertwined easily, naturally, and the warmth of her skin against mine seemed to say what words could not. I told her, quietly, that I cared, not as a fleeting attraction or a passing whim, but as someone who wanted to be present for her, who wanted to understand her fully and walk beside her through the shadows and light alike. She looked up then, her eyes glistening with the barest hint of unshed tears, and I saw the subtle shift in her posture, shoulders relaxing, lips curving in a tentative, vulnerable smile. The atmosphere around us changed. Words became unnecessary. We sat in quiet intimacy, fingers still entwined, letting the comfort of presence speak for us. I noticed the small details that always drew me in. The soft warmth of her breath, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the way her eyes softened when they met mine. In that quiet, I realized that emotional intimacy could be more powerful than any declaration of love, a steady, grounding bond that needed no dramatic gestures to feel real. By the end of the afternoon, the tension that had held us apart began to dissolve. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden flood of words, only the quiet revelation of hearts slowly revealing themselves to one another. I understood, in that shared silence and gentle touch, that our connection had moved beyond fascination, beyond curiosity, into something tender, steadfast, and deeply human. We were no longer just two people crossing paths by chance. We had become a presence in each other's lives, aware of the fragility and strength in the other, ready to take the next step together, carefully, intentionally, and wholly. The world felt softer that evening, as if it had conspired to give us a private corner away from the noise and haste of life. After weeks of subtle glances, quiet conversations, and shared silences, the space between us had shrunk to something tangible, a presence that neither needed words nor grand gestures to confirm its reality. We walked together along a narrow, tree-lined path, the last of the sunlight filtering through branches, painting golden patterns on the pavement. The air carried the faint scent of rain and earth, grounding us in the moment, reminding us that the world could wait. She matched my pace effortlessly, her arm occasionally brushing mine, and each contact was electric yet gentle, a quiet affirmation of closeness. I noticed the small, habitual gestures I had come to cherish. The way her eyes lit when she spotted a stray bloom on the path, the subtle tilt of her head as she considered something I had said, the delicate way her fingers occasionally hovered near mine, testing the space between us. And then, finally, she let her hand rest fully in mine. It wasn't forced, it wasn't dramatic, it simply was a steady, warm connection that spoke volumes. We paused at a small park bench, the quiet hum of the city fading into the background. She leaned slightly against me, her head resting gently on my shoulder, and I could feel her steady heartbeat, rhythmic and comforting. There was a weight lifted in her posture, a sense of release, as though finally allowing herself to be fully present with someone who mattered. I ran my fingers lightly along her hand, tracing the lines as if memorizing them, savoring the simplicity of the touch, the quiet affirmation that we belonged in that moment together. We spoke little, and the silence itself became a language we both understood. I caught glimpses of vulnerability softened by trust, strength softened by tenderness. Her gaze met mine in fleeting moments, shy yet steady, conveying more than words ever could. And I realized how deeply this connection had settled into my life, how her presence had shifted the rhythm of my days, making each one warmer, quieter, and more deliberate. Even as night fell, bringing a chill in the air, neither of us moved to break the closeness. The world continued its course, but in that little space, time seemed suspended. She finally whispered something small, a laugh, a remark about the stars beginning to appear, and I felt a lightness, a joy in knowing that these shared moments of peace and presence were what love could feel like. No declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the steady, growing warmth of two hearts choosing to be near each other. As we walked back, our fingers still entwined, I understood fully what had been building since our first encounter. This was not fleeting, and it was not fragile. It was quietly enduring, a bond forged through attentiveness, empathy, and care. The hesitations, the pauses, the conflicts, and tender gestures had all led to this. A relationship where closeness was natural, trust was unspoken, and love had grown in the subtle, profound way that only time and quiet understanding could nurture. And in that realization, I smiled inwardly. We were together, fully present in one another's lives, with the gentle assurance that whatever came next, we would face it side by side, patient, attentive, and unafraid of the quiet, steady love we had cultivated.